It is hot across the country, both outside and in the NBA hot stove. LeBron James is headed to the Lakers. I'm sure that made everyone's Twitter a little more fun last night. It certainly made mine as someone who follows the NBA but doesn't necessarily go too much into it. More of a college guy. Has obviously, if you follow my account, you know that. But we've still got a lot of college basketball to talk about, and so we're here on the CBB Central podcast, beginning a deep dive season. So we're going to go real deep on every single team that we can in college basketball throughout the offseason. Today we're doing Oregon and St. John's. A few things to touch on before we get to that. But Brad, how you doing, my man? What's your first reaction to LeBron news? Because I feel like any basketball podcast has to at least touch on it for 30 seconds or so.
I mean, it was pretty abrupt. Just kind of just scrolling through Twitter, and you got a tweet from the actual Woj. It wasn't a fake account, and it was like LeBron for a 4-year deal to the Lakers. It's pretty surprising. And the Lakers kind of rounded out their roster last night with a motley crew of potential role players. But kind of a side note, I absolutely love fake account season. I love when people get one over on someone. Like I saw one that was from Bleacher Report, obviously instead of Bleacher Report, and it fooled a lot of people. I think it was about Kawhi being traded to the 76ers or something like that. But that's a nice little fun aspect of Twitter that a lot of people get unnecessarily up in arms about.
Fake account season's nuts. The way I make sure I avoid it is I always just set tweet alerts for Woj and Shams, so I would never miss like a deal, like a Kawhi deal. If that were to happen, I would get the official tweet notification during deadline season. But it's always fun to see people slip up. But before we get into our two deep dives, as I mentioned, we're doing Oregon and St. John's, two teams I'm really excited about. We do want to touch on just one bigger piece of news in college basketball, and that is LeGerald Vick is headed back to Kansas for his senior year. Vick's time in Kansas has been up and down, to say the least. There's been all sorts of controversy surrounding him. It appeared he was leaving after the season. Wound up taking his name out of the NBA draft. Didn't look like he would return to school. All of a sudden, he is, and back at Kansas. And Brad, obviously a talented player, but certainly has caused his fair share of trouble in his time in Lawrence. What are your expectations for him this year in his senior season?
So I'm not a huge fan of Vic. I mean, obviously, to average 13-5 or a 12-5, for a top, 5 team in the country, obviously like a very good player. But I'm just not a huge fan of. He's not like a great feel for the game guy. He's like super athletic. He can shoot the ball pretty well. But watching him is often very, very frustrating with his decision making. And I think he probably moves into the starting lineup. Alongside whoever starts at point guard between Moore and Dodson, and then next to Quentin Grimes on the wing, and you also have Marcus Garrett in there who's going to get a lot of minutes. But I don't know if he's necessarily someone that could play like a small ball 4. I know that they use, I think Svi was technically the small ball 4 last year, but with a guy like Dedrick Lawson there, and then KJ Lawson too, I just don't know how much more value Vic adds than having Marcus Garrett in that lineup.
Yeah, and I think Garrett's awareness and his kind of glue guy tendencies do provide a bit more in those regards than Vic in some ways. Kansas kind of was interesting last year where Vic was the 3 offensively, and Svi Mikhailuk was that small ball 4 where he'd get some pick and pop looks, and then on defense he typically guarded 4s because Svi was so skinny. Vic had a better chance, so that was always an interesting dynamic. I mean, he's a very athletic player. Certainly his collegiate experience. Shot the ball at 37% last year, which is I think pretty impressive for a guy who I've never really thought of as a great shooter. He just did a very solid job. Actually did a little bit of creation with the 2 assists per game. I kind of agree that Garrett might provide more, but I think perhaps this also does provide, just a chance for him to be humbled. Leaving the team, maybe going into a bench role. I could see him being a super valuable 6th man if that's a spot where he is willing to accept that role. I think a bench with, to say, him, Charlie Moore, and then Silvio De Souza is just absolutely absurd in terms of the athleticism and the scoring upside. So the Jayhawks get deeper, the Jayhawks get better, even though I know neither of us are super high on LeGerald Vick.
I think that was really the only big news. I mean, whenever a guy who averages, double figures kind of falls out of the sky and lands onto a top 5 team, is always a big deal. Kind of similar to Reed Travis going to Kentucky, which we talked about a lot last time. Obviously Travis is much better than Vic, but still definitely a noteworthy addition to this team, which is going to be one of, if not the deepest team in the country. And I can't wait to see how the minutes are distributed, especially in the front court, where you have a bunch of different centers and guys like Lawson who could potentially play small. It's going to be a very interesting to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kansas is definitely a team we will go in depth on at some point this offseason and look to spend 20 to 30 minutes on them in a podcast. And that's really what we're looking to do for much of the rest of the offseason, is these deep dive type shows where we're going to give you 20 to 30 minutes, as much analysis as we can, that you wouldn't necessarily get anywhere else on one team. We'll do 2 an episode, and that's what we're starting off with today, Brad, with Oregon and St. John's. I think we'll start with Oregon, and this Oregon team made a huge splash. This is the other big addition of the college basketball week, with Ehab Amin kind of rounding out their roster for next year, even though they do have several scholarships available. Can't imagine there's going to be a player added to the rotation at this point. But this has a chance, in my book, to be one of the most interesting teams in college basketball. I don't know where you necessarily want to start, but why don't we just start with the Amin addition? What do you think he brings to the table? Obviously, statistically, he's been a very nice player for Texas A&M Corpus Christi, contributes defensively, a good slasher. To me, it's just a really nice piece to either start or come off the bench, playing either guard spot.
Yeah, so I think the Amin and Peyton Pritchard backcourt has some pretty solid potential. Obviously, he's replacing a guy in Elijah Brown, who is a big-time scorer and a very frustrating player to watch. I don't think he's even remotely the same player. I think he's more of a team guy than Elijah Brown was, and he's obviously not the shooter and scorer, but defensively he's going to make a major addition. And I would assume that Amin starts. Victor Bailey, I think, would also get some consideration at that 2-guard spot, and maybe even Will Richardson, who's an incoming freshman. But I mean, it's absolutely a huge addition. I kind of also wanted to start with kind of a synopsis of Oregon last year. So I mean, they finished 75th in KenPom. They were a 3 seed in the NIT, lost to Marquette in the second round after beating Rider in the first round. They were 10-8 in the Pac-12. But the main problem with them seemed to be their lack of cohesion, because they had some very talented players, many of them newcomers to the team. They were 340th in the country in minutes continuity. They only returned 18% of minutes from the previous season, which was obviously that Final Four team that lost many players to early entry to the NBA. So they returned 18% of their minutes. The average in the country is 48%, and that was definitely a main contributor to their struggles. And then, besides like obvious anomalies in terms of minutes returning, like Duke and Kentucky, most notable programs with that low of continuity were very bad. So among teams that were in that 25% or lower range, in that bottom 300 in the country in terms of minutes continuity, Pitt, Cal, South Florida, Memphis, Iowa State, Dayton, East Carolina, and then you got two pretty good teams in there as well, with Syracuse and Western Kentucky, along with obviously Duke and Kentucky, who have these transcendent recruiting classes every year.
Yeah, I think that's a super valuable thing to kind of bring in, and Oregon was just they were kind of forced into this spot given some of the draft departures, and I think Dana Altman did a really good job of just bringing in grad transfer who made this team competitive. And they weren't all that close to the bubble, but at the same time, they could have easily been. They lost so many close games last year, especially in Pac-12 play. I'll just run through their Pac-12 losses here. They lost just going backwards from the conference tournament all the way up through the season. They lost by 20 to UCLA, not UCLA, USC in the Pac-12 tournament. That was their final game of the Pac-12 tournament. That was a pretty big blowout. But other than that, they lost by 2 at Washington State. They lost in overtime to UCLA on the road. Lost by 2 to USC. A 35-point loss at Stanford. A 5-point loss to USC. 7 at Arizona. 12-point loss at Oregon State, and a 10-point loss at Utah. They were in a lot of games. And then even in the non-conference, they had a 10-point loss to Oklahoma, a 3-point loss to Boise State, and an 8-point loss to UConn. This team wasn't that far away, where if they stole 3 or 4 of those games, they could have been right on the bubble. And I think some of that continuity that's where that comes into play, as well as the depth. I don't think they had the requisite depth to be a contender last season. They were pretty thin, but overall, I don't think this team was as bad as some people really thought, and they gave a lot of people a tough test throughout Pac-12 play.
Yeah, so they were 235th nationally in terms of using their bench, and I was watching some Oregon film earlier this morning. I watched some of the first half of a game late in the Pac-12 season, and the lack of continuity and like the lack of cohesion among the players was so apparent. I mean, there was one play where Troy Brown is on an advantage situation, and he chooses to pull up for a heavily contested 2 when Elijah Brown was wide open under the basket. There's another play where Mikhail McIntosh gets an offensive rebound, and Elijah Brown was right behind him for an open 3, and Brown started to run back on defense. McIntosh didn't see or didn't realize, and just threw the ball straight out of bounds. And it was just plays like that. The players were clearly frustrated with each other. Even Brown and Peyton Pritchard were hitting shots, but they were taking really tough, difficult, contested looks. The ball wasn't moving very well. It was a lot of one-on-one. It was just definitely indicative of a team that just never really gelled, because Mikhail McIntosh is very good. He's a borderline NBA player. Troy Brown, obviously, first rounder with the Washington Wizards, and then Pritchard is one of the best players in the Pac-12. Elijah Brown's a great scorer, but I mean, it just never really clicked.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's something I saw even from them. I didn't see as much as I would have liked of them last season, just because West Coast games and things of that nature. When you're an NIT team, pretty much from day one, don't necessarily get the credence in my time that I might have liked. But I have kind of reviewed some of what they've done last season, and then I think the question is there's a lot of not a lot of continuity from last year to this year. Now, obviously, Paul White is back. Peyton Pritchard is back, and Victor Bailey, as well as Kenny Wooten, are the 4 key rotation players, along with Abu Kigab, who played for the Canadian national team last summer and had a small role with this Oregon team last year. Those are the returners. But then it's a lot of new faces. And Brad, do you want to touch on those? I mean, this might be the best recruiting class, top to bottom in the country.
Yep. So they have four incoming freshmen plus Ehab Amin. All 4 of the players are ranked in the top 75. The highest ranked player is obviously Bol, who's a stretch 5. He's super skilled, but he also has the length and the ability to protect the rim defensively. The kind of downside with him is he didn't seem to be super active and engaged on the court. He kind of floats, but I mean his skill set is undeniably intriguing. But the main question with Bol this year is he more of a prospect or a player? The freshman learning curve for big men is very steep. I mean, just looking at former top 5 rated big men as freshmen, they don't really have a huge impact, traditionally at least, on their teams. Their teams winning as a freshman. You have guys like Cam Ridley and Isaiah Austin, who both really struggled as freshmen, even though they were like top 5 recruits. Even a guy like Steven Adams really struggled, or like didn't really show his full capabilities of what he would be in the NBA. And then guys like Miles Turner had to play out of position. Bamba didn't have a huge impact on winning, even though he was probably the best college player out of that group. So even if a guy is a super talented prospect and will be a solid NBA player, it doesn't necessarily mean as a freshman big man that they will dramatically raise their team's winning or spot in the college basketball hierarchy.
Yeah, Bol is really interesting. I do want to touch on one more guy who could possibly join this Oregon team. That's Francis Okoro. He's currently a 2019 commit, the Chicago area native who committed in May. It's still possible he reclassifies. I don't think he's quite as necessary to this Oregon team as it would have been for, say, if he had committed to Illinois. I think a reclassification would have been more necessary. But he's a guy who is a 6'9" big guy, very athletic, who would also help this team. But going back to Bol, this is it's such an interesting. I don't think there's a freshman I'm more interested to watch in college basketball because he is the true definition of one of these unicorn type talents. I mean, he shot 49% from three in 15 EYBL games last year. Then shot it a little poorer at Peach Jam for down to 44% for his entire season. But he's an absolutely absurd shooter. Shot 66% from the field overall, 49% or 63%, 44% from three, averaging 22 points. Also blocked an absurd amount of shots. He averaged 3.9 blocks per game throughout his Nike EYBL season. So, I mean, he's a guy who he may not necessarily contribute to winning as a superstar. I don't think he's going to win like Pac-12 Player of the Year or anything. But he's going to be so valuable in what he provides in terms of he's going to provide spacing. He's going to provide a ton of rim protection. And then he's such a unicorn talent because not only is he good catch and shoot, but he can put the ball on the floor a little bit. Now, obviously, I don't think Oregon wants Bol putting the ball on the deck for consistently for this team and being a creator of offense, but at the same time he has the ability to take a couple of dribbles and maybe shoot a floater or a step back jump shot in a way that I don't think we've ever seen a 7'2" guy do in college basketball. So certainly one of the most intriguing freshmen in the country.
So I listed out three major question marks for Oregon, and the first one being also relates to Bol. Besides what impact Bol will have, can he and Kenny Wooten play together? Kenny Wooten is one of the best returning sophomores in the country. He played a reserve role last year, played about 20 minutes a game, but showed that he's a potential pro as he's a super athletic shot blocker and a guy who can catch lobs and like make an impact in the paint. But with Bol there, his path to playing time is kind of blocked again. So I just think, I've been seeing a lot of projected Oregon lineups that has Wooten at the 4, Bol at the 5. I think the major question is, can they play together? Because Wooten pretty much played the 5 all last year, kind of split that position with Paul White. And while it's kind of like, I can see that it's kind of the Bell-Boucher dynamic set in terms of like Bol can shoot, Boucher can shoot. Bol block shots and Wooten block shots, just like how Bell and Boucher block shots. But it's not like a great comparison because Bell is such a versatile defensive player. He can guard perimeter players, and Boucher I think is a more natural fit next to Bell than Bol and Wooten are together.
Yeah, I think I'm a little higher than consensus on the ability for these two guys to play together. I think offensively, it'll work out fine. I think it actually accentuates both players' strengths because it'll allow Bol to play on the perimeter a little bit more, not force him to play in the post as much. Wooten can kind of focus on being a rim runner and lob catcher. It's not the perfect fit by any means, but I think it's going to fit pretty well defensively. Bol is going to be able to come over from the weak side. Also, when he is in the paint, it's going to just be hard to shoot over him, but his long arms will be, I think, really intriguing as a weak side rim protector. I mean, Wooten averaged 2.6 blocks in 20 minutes a game last year. He was absolutely absurd in terms of his shot blocking ability. So I'm really just intrigued to see how this pairing works out. I think it can work out pretty well. But the good news is, Wooten only played 20 minutes a game. I think you could keep him in that 20 to 25-minute role, play Bowl in the 25 to 28-minute range. I don't think he's a guy you want to get gassed on the floor. So you could play both of those guys in that 20, 25-minute range. Paul White remaining in that 20 to 25-minute role, and then all three can play together. You're never going to play all three together. So two on the floor at once, each of them providing a different skill set.
Yeah, I think it's also going to be interesting to see if White can effectively move from the 5 where he played last year, back up to the 4. Because I mean, there's no minutes for him at the 5, but his floor spacing and his ability to face up and shoot could be very valuable to this team. I think it's also interesting that maybe if that 2 big man pairing doesn't work, even if a Paul White and Bowl pairing isn't as effective, they could maybe turn to Abu Kijab at the 4, who had a very disappointing freshman year, but showed on the FIBA circuit that he has some serious potential. Maybe could play some small ball 4, and Oregon can get back to being kind of like a wing centric lineup.
Yeah, I was also thinking about Lewis King potentially getting some minutes as a small ball 4. I think there could be kind of a death lineup of Pritchard, Amin, Will Richardson, Luke King, and then either Bowl or Kenny Wooten at the 5. Bowl, you could potentially go 5 out and just space you out and get one-on-ones everywhere on the perimeter. With Wooten, he could set lots of screens, roll to the rim, attract attention for open shooters. So I think there's a ton of lineup flexibility, and I did really want to touch on Luke King because he's a guy who is as talented as any recruit in the country. I know there have been concerns at times about his motor. He's been a recruit who's kind of went up and down. At one point seen as a definitive top 10 guy in this class, now kind of hovers in that 20 range. But to me, he's a guy, him and Cam Reddish have been the 2 recruits where we've consistently heard about the motor not necessarily being there, but at the same time, just the absurd amount of upside that he has. He's got a game-ready body. On the EYBL circuit, average 17 points per game in less than 25 minutes of contest, rebounded the ball well, has some ability to create off the bounce, very long arms to potentially get some steals. So I'm excited about Luke King's potential, where he's not being thrust into a situation where he has to produce huge production right away, but at the same time being allowed to kind of develop as the season goes on with his considerable upside.
I think Oregon kind of needs King to be that secondary scorer. I mean, just like looking at a potential starting lineup, let's just say, I mean, the one that I have right now is Pritchard, Amin, King, White, and Bowl. So I mean, I think King is probably the second leading scorer in that lineup. I mean, White is more of a complementary piece, even though he's an older, experienced player. Same with Ehab Amin. He's more defensive minded, and then Bowl with his kind of inconsistency and up and down play. I think King really needs to be that second scorer for Oregon, and I think he's currently injured. I think he's supposed to be ready for the start of the year, but that's one of my major questions for Oregon is will King be ready both health wise and in terms of production to be a big scorer, like a secondary scorer on a potential top 20, top 15, wherever people have Oregon squad, like a team that could win the Pac-12 and maybe even I've seen people have Oregon in the top 10, which I think is very aggressive, especially relying on these guys like King and Bowl, who are super talented but have legitimate concerns about their up and down play.
Yeah, I will say one thing about this recruiting class, and it's these guys all come from very high level programs. Will Richardson went to Oak Hill. He's a guy we haven't touched on yet, but he's a top 50 recruit in his own right, an extremely talented guard who's had a lot of really good performances this last year or so in both AAU and in high school basketball. Lewis King played for Hudson Catholic, a top program in New Jersey. Bowl went to, I believe he was at Hillcrest Prep in Arizona. I could be wrong on that. I had that listed and I've misplaced it. But those 3 core recruits have played a lot of high level basketball between AAU and high school, combined with Ehab Amin, who's super experienced. I think there's a lot of game ready aspect to this team that you might not see from other top recruits.
Yeah, I think that Richardson is. I wouldn't say he's the biggest X factor, but he's definitely a X factor for this team. He's a lefty scoring guard. You mentioned, he's a top 50 recruit. He can shoot. He can get to the rim. I think it's going to be very interesting to see, what kind of role he plays, because they have Ehab Amin, they have Victor Bailey coming back, who averaged almost 7 points a game as a freshman. But Richardson could conceivably beat out both of them, and I think he'll be in the rotation regardless. So he's someone that, if he can bring some competent minutes in there, Oregon could be even better than some people think. I mean, this top 9 of this rotation is legitimately very good. I think Miles Norris is probably the odd man out of the rotation. He's the 10th man on the team. He's more of a long-term piece, kind of like a face-up 4-man who can shoot a little bit. He's kind of awkward though with his movements right now. I think he's more long-term, but he's a top 75 recruit in his own right too. So when the one person in your rotation is the one person out of your rotation is a top 75 recruit, just speaks to how deep this team is.
Yeah, I completely agree. I did want to touch on the best player on this team. We haven't really gotten into him too much, and what type of believer you are and I am in Peyton Pritchard. He's a guy who really went under the radar last year, just because of the amount that Oregon really went under the radar. They were never really out of it, but never really in it. This is a guy who averaged 15 points, 4 rebounds, 5 assists. Shot 58% true shooting percentage, 41% from 3, despite being circled on most scouting reports. Took care of the basketball pretty well with a 2.5 to 1 assist to turnover ratio. He's one of the better point guards I think in the country. But I'm interested to see how his role develops next to these top players, whether it's Bol, whether it's Liu King. How much of the ball will he see? How much of a scoring onus will be on him versus how much will he be looked to more as a natural distributor? I'm really excited to see his progression this season.
Yeah. I think he's definitely Oregon's best player in terms of college, and I think he's definitely one of the best players in the Pac-12 or even the country. I mean, he averaged like 14 a game this year or last year. I think he could get up into that 16 to 18 range this year, and like really cement himself as like an all Pac-12 player. His distribution improved last year, and that's with a team that wasn't, the pieces that didn't exactly fit. I think this team, the pieces could fit better. Guys like King and Bailey and Richardson, and even the bigs like Bol and White can all shoot the ball. So I think that his assist numbers could also take a huge step up. Between Oregon's 3-point shooting, having this strong alpha point guard player in Peyton Pritchard, and then having all this depth, this is a really strong team, and I think I'm higher on Oregon after taking this deep dive than I was previously.
Yeah, and I think we do have to remember that Dana Altman is their coach and one of the better, I think, coaches in the country in terms of the job he does, not only recruiting, but his ability to develop talent and coach guys, find hidden gems like Chris Boucher and develop them over time. I think this team will get better as the season goes on, as they get more experienced. I think, to me, they're the best team in the Pac-12 going into the season.
I have them at number 2 behind Washington. Previously, I had them right outside the top 25, mainly because of, I had mentioned previously, relying on King and Bol, who are more up and down players, and are freshmen, and kind of what I detailed about the freshman big man earlier. But I think I'm leaning more toward including him toward the back of the top 25. I still think that having them in the high teens or even top 10 is way too high, but I think anywhere between 15 to 25 is a very, very reasonable rank, and then either first or second in the Pac-12 for Oregon.
Yeah, I'll chart my kind of time on Oregon. So right after the season, I put them at number 9 in my preseason poll, my directly after national championship game poll. And then right after draft decisions, I kind of thought it over more. I moved him down to number 14. I think that's about where I'll have them going into the season, somewhere in the 12 to 17 range. Number 1 in the Pac-12. I'm high on Washington, not quite as high as you are, Brad. I just think with this team, the athleticism, the experience at point guard, which is something I really look at, the coaching, just up and down. It's a lot of things that I really like in a team, and so I'm kind of falling for them. Ehab Amin certainly helps them, just as a defensive pest and a guy who Peyton Pritchard's not the best defender. Now, he's better than he gets credit for, I think. But I think adding a guy like Amin is really valuable in that it lets Peyton Pritchard guard the lesser offensive guard of the two, where he can guard maybe some twos who aren't as good scorers, who are more kind of glue guy twos, and let Ehab Amin handle some of the star guards, like maybe a Jalen Hands when they're playing UCLA, for instance. I think they've just plugged a lot of holes for me to have them as a top 15 team.
Yeah, so looking at the top 25 composite, finding 16 of these early top 25 polls, Oregon's average ranking is 17.88. The highest is, someone has them at 10th, and they're in 13 of the 16 top 25. So, I mean, this is pretty clearly a composite top 25 team at this point, and no one has them in the top 10 anymore. But you mentioned you had them at 14, and then most have them around this 17 or 18 spot.
I think that's about right. I do want to mention real quick on Oregon is there is some breaking news around the college basketball landscape. Bryson Williams, who did visit Oregon during his recruiting process, is just committed to UTEP, to Rodney Terry and staff. So that's not an addition that this team will be making. He would have been a sit 1, play 2 transfer anyway, so he wouldn't have contributed to this year's team, but would have been a nice get long term for the Ducks. He'll head to UTEP, which is a really big pickup for them.
Yeah, I was surprised hearing that because Oregon has 3 more scholarships to fill, and they could definitely lose some guys to the NBA like Bowl or Kenny Wooten or even Luke King after the season. So there were definitely potential minutes there for Williams, but he joins one of the many transfers to go play for Rodney Terry.
Yeah, it's definitely a huge get. I think we should transition now over to the second team that we wanted to go deep in on this show. This is one that we had a couple of requests to do in St. John's on Twitter. And as always, guys, feel free to send in which teams you want to hear about, and we'll try to get to as many as we can this offseason. But St. John's, this is a pivotal year for this program. This is a pivotal year for Chris Mullen. I think we should definitely start by summing up what last season was, Brad. And it was definitely an interesting season for the Johnnies. Started so promisingly. I saw this team play against they played against St. Joe's at a event at Mohegan Sun in December, and this is a team that was playing extremely good basketball. Had gotten several wins out of the gate. Did lose that one game to Missouri that they probably shouldn't have, and had the loss to Arizona State. But otherwise, they were sitting pretty and looked to be a clear NCAA tournament team. And then it all fell apart after that game. They lost 11 games in a row to start Big East play, then rattled off 4 in a row, including Duke and Villanova, and then dropped 3 of 4 to end the regular season, beat Georgetown in the Big East tournament, and then fell to Xavier. And it's overall 16-17 season, and Chris Mullen yet to really make a move, still under 500 in year 3. This has to be the year, right, Brad?
Absolutely, and I think with the talent on this team, there's absolutely no excuse for not making the NCAA tournament, even if Mustafa Heron's not eligible. I mean, last season I kind of give them a pass because I think if Marcus Levette had stayed on the team, I think that they would have made the NCAA tournament. His departure kind of coincided with them losing 11 straight Big East games, and they lacked that secondary scorer on the perimeter. Justin Simon is like an elite glue guy, but having Marcus Levet and Pons together was really dynamic for their offense. And it's also very interesting because I didn't realize that they were top 30 in defense on KenPom, and they were 74th overall, so they were actually one spot ahead of Oregon. But I think what plagued St. John's was a little inconsistency, a little lack of discipline, and their biggest weakness, which I don't know if they've addressed for this year, is rebounding. They were one of the worst rebounding teams in the country, both offensively and defensively. They're big men like Tarek Owens, great shot blocker, super athletic, but he wasn't a rebounder, and they really struggled in that area despite having an otherwise really strong defense statistically, which was super surprising.
Yeah, they improved a lot defensively, and that was something that Chris Mullen talked a lot about in the one press conference I was at after that St. Joe's game, is how much they'd improved on that on the end of the floor. And I think Simon helped a lot with that in terms of his versatility. He's an excellent rebounder as a guard. But as you said, they don't really address too much that rebounding concern. But let's see what they do address. Let's kind of go through this recruiting class that they have coming in. So they first have 2 transfers who sat out last season who will be eligible this year. Those would be Mikey Dixon from Quinnipiac and CD Cada from from South Carolina. Mikey Dixon was the MAC Rookie of the Year at Quinnipiac on a pretty bad Quinnipiac team. Then transferred following Tom Moore's firing. He was a guy who averaged over 16 points a game as a freshman, Delaware native. Averaged 4 rebounds, 2 assists, shot 45% from the field, 37% from 3. Mikey's a guy who, to me, isn't necessarily a point guard, but I think he's going to provide them some scoring off the bench. And then CD Cada, who might be the key to this entire team, given their lack of front court depth. He played 10 minutes a game at South Carolina. Didn't necessarily impress, but was a hype recruit out of high school. He'll be expected to do a lot in the front court for this team. 3 freshmen, Greg Williams Jr., Josh Roberts, and Marcellus Erlington, none of whom are necessarily elite recruits, but all certainly in range for a Big East program. Williams is a 4-star. Josh Roberts, a 3-star, and Marcellus Erlington, I believe a 2-star recruit, but has played football a lot, so his recruiting went under the radar. And then JUCO player LJ Figueroa, who's a former 4-star. They bring in Mustafa Heron, who is a sit-out transfer, but very good chance he's able to play this year, from Auburn. Eli Wright is a sit-out transfer from Mississippi State, and David Caraher, a sit-out transfer from Houston Baptist. So a lot of new faces to this St. John's team.
Yes, I think obviously if Mustafa Heron is eligible, he's the biggest addition. I mean, he averaged 16-5 on a very good Auburn team, was an all SEC level talent. He'll step right in and post similar stats, add another scoring piece to that backcourt. He'll be a great fit next to Justin Simon and Shamori Pons, and that's going to be one of the best perimeter trios in the entire country. And then in terms of Seti Keita, he's a very interesting player. He's not necessarily a stretch 5, but he can face up. He's very skilled offensively. He got hurt early in the preseason. Late in the preseason, close to the season, on that South Carolina team that ended up making the Final Four. So he kind of returned to the team late, and he was beat out by Chris Silva, who's obviously a very, very talented big man, and then Mike Kotsar, who's a freshman at the time. He's going to be a junior this year. And the two of them really had a strong front court pairing, kind of pushed Keita into that third big man role, and he wasn't really able to show kind of what he could do. Now as the starting center for St. John's, I expect him to have a huge season, really kind of stabilize that front court, maybe like 8 or 9 points a game and 5 or 6 rebounds for Keita. Rebounding, as we touched on earlier, is going to be the key for St. John's. So he really needs to manage the backboards there. And they've totally revamped their bench as well. Now, they were 347th last year in terms of bench minutes. They add 2 top-notch reserves. It's going to be hard for other teams to match this sort of bench talent. And that's LJ Figueroa and Mikey Dixon. We talked on Dixon earlier, and then Figueroa former New Mexico State commit, always had problems in terms of qualifying, but he can score, he can shoot. He's going to be a great sixth man. And if St. John's wants to go small with like Clark at the 5 and like Heron and Figueroa as like the forwards, I think that could be a really dynamic offensive lineup. We'll see if that lineup can rebound and defend at a high enough level, if that's a direction that Chris Mullin wants to go into.
Yeah, that's kind of my favorite part about this team is just the positional versatility on the wing between Mustafa Heron, Justin Simon, and LJ Figueroa. All three very big-bodied wings who can do a ton of different things on the floor. Simon obviously played last season and really blossomed as the season went on. Was a triple-double threat at times, nearly had a triple-double in the game that I covered. He averaged 12 points, 7 rebounds, 5 assists. And then you talk about LJ Figueroa. He's a guy who had very big numbers across the board in junior college. Obviously, it's difficult to kind of reconcile JUCO statistics because you don't understand necessarily the context behind what they were doing. But he's 6'5", about 200 pounds at this point, and he averaged 21 points, 6 rebounds, 4 assists, shot 48% from the three, and then obviously Mustafa Heron, who averaged 6 rebounds as a freshman, 5 rebounds as a sophomore, as you mentioned, the 16 points per game last season. They just have so much versatility, so much rebounding, and so much switchability on defense in that 2 through 4. I really cannot wait to see the first Pons, Simon, Heron, Figueroa, and then either Marvin Clark or Sidy Keita at the 5. I just think there's so much excitement about a lineup like that. And then obviously you have the small guard you can play behind Pons and Mikey Dixon, who can be a scorer and create his own offense. You have another guard who can score off the bench in Greg Williams. You have and then 2 bigs who will help in the front court in Josh Roberts and Marcellus Earlington, who will give them minutes behind Marvin Clark and Sidy Keita.
Yeah, I think that Roberts and Earlington are going to have to play at the 5 and in the 4 respectively. Earlington's like that prototypical like undersized kind of physical 4-man. And then Roberts is like a long, athletic kind of finisher, shot blocker, like a long-term piece. I don't think either of them probably projects as being able to provide competent minutes right away. I mean, they're both ranked in the 260s in the 24/7 composite. I know you mentioned with Earlington, he was a football player, so that's why he was so under the radar. Then this team loses Tarek Owens and Bashir Ahmed, and then both of those guys were very good players. I think that Figueroa and Seta Keita should be able to replace their talents and production. Obviously, Mustafa Heron's a much better player than Bashir Ahmed, but that could be something to watch. That all these new pieces blending together. It's also important not to forget that two starters are leaving this team.
Yeah, and with new pieces blending together, one of the things I'm always looking for is coaching, and I don't necessarily think I have the confidence in Chris Mullin to say that he'll be able to put those pieces together at least right away. So that's definitely a concern of mine. One other concern that I kind of have with the St. John's team is what is Shamori Pons going to be as a shooter? Now that he has a lot more help off the ball in terms of he doesn't have to create everything for this offense, it'll be really interesting to see how he rebounds as a shooter, because as a freshman, shot 38% from 3. It was pretty good. And then the next season, on about the same number of attempts last year, shot 25%. I think certainly a degree of it was he had no help and was gassed on the floor a lot of times, and was defenders draped him all game. But at the same time, I do think there has to be a little bit of concern with his shooting going into the season, especially given he'll get a lot more, I think, uncontested looks.
Yeah, I think that his shooting is going to revert back to his freshman year form. I mean, there were times where Pons was really like the only guy who could create his own shot and create other shots. I mean, Simon is not a great shooter. He can create a little bit. Clark is a very good player, but not really someone you want to create offense. And then Ahmed was more of like a spot up shooter kind of type. Then Owens was pretty much just like a finisher. He had a little bit of ability to stretch the floor, but not much. So that was just so much a responsibility on Pons. And now that you bring in all this additional offensive talent, Heron, Figueroa, Dixon, etc., and they got like Seti Kita, who I think is probably a better offensive player than Owens. Just that increased talent level, I think will pay huge dividends for Pons and his shooting ability.
Yeah, that's kind of where I lean as well. What are you thinking? In terms of starting lineup here, because I think it's probably day one. Let's assume that Heron is eligible. I think he will be. Shamori Pons, Justin Simon, Mustafa Heron, Marvin Clark, and Seti Kita. I think would be the game one starting five, with Figueroa, Williams, and Dixon off the bench in the backcourt. Roberts giving them and Erlington giving him some front court depth, and then we'll obviously see a little bit more of those small ball lineups throughout the game.
Yeah, and then they also have Brian Trimble too, who was in the rotation this past year. He didn't play very well. He's like a shooter. I mean, all freshmen for the most part struggle to shoot. So I think if given the opportunity, maybe he could shoot the ball better, give him some 3-point shooting. But that team doesn't really need it. I mean, he's kind of been recruited over with Dixon and Figueroa off the bench. I think that we could see St. John's run like a more tight rotation with that top seven, and then Erlington and Roberts and Williams playing like very sparingly, like only when needed. Kita, they need like 25 to 30 minutes a game from Seti Kita. That other 10 minutes a game, I don't think that you can give that to guys like Roberts and Erlington, especially in a conference play, unless these guys are like major surprises. So this lineup with Clark at the 5 and Heron and Figueroa at the forwards, that could be a reality for at least 10 minutes a game. I wonder if the offense of that lineup can offset the defense, because St. John's last year was much better defensively than offensively, but they lose their rim protector and Tarek Owens. They were elite at defending in the paint and defending 2-point shots, but they struggled to give up 3-pointers last year. And the year before, the offense was very good with Marcus Levette, Malik Ellison, Shamori Pons, etc., but their defense was atrocious. So I wonder if they can add these offensive pieces without losing what made them such a successful defensive team last season.
Yeah, I think that is an excellent point. I would say the one thing that I've kind of been looking at is I don't think, especially in Big East play, their lack of size will be exposed as much, just because the league is going fairly small. You look at Villanova plays a small ball brand. Marquette is a team that likes to go small. Creighton, usually a 4-out, 1-in type of team. Providence likes to play more of a stretch for a smaller guy. Georgetown definitely embraces a big man, but even they might go some smaller looks with Jamarco Pickett or Josh LeBlanc at the 4 next season, and then Xavier, a team that likes to space you out as well. So I do think the Big East especially has embraced kind of these small ball looks where St. John's might not be as exposed to some bigger teams.
Yeah, but I think if Clark is at center, I mean, he's going to have to guard Jesse Govan, Nate Watson, Martin Krompel, Tyreek Jones, and Zach Hankins, even like an Ed Morrow for Marquette. So while these teams are only using one big for the most part, I mean, Providence is probably going to run with 2 bigs with Holt and Watson. But for the most part, I think we could see, Clark either get into foul trouble or like really get owned on the offensive end by like these much bigger true centers that some of these teams are throwing out these days.
because they'll be so. Brad, are you there? Are you there?
Yes.
We had a bit of a lost connection. Hopefully, all of that came through. I was just talking about maybe St. John's looking at a little bit of a zone look, given the fact that they have such length but lack of depth at center, and obviously the potential for foul trouble with Kita is there. So I think zone might be the way they go for them, although it does negate some of that athleticism and versatility on the wings that I really like about the St. John's team.
So I think we're kind of wrapping up St. John's. I just want to throw out some major questions that I had for St. John's, just as it's kind of like summing it up here. We've touched on most of this, but I think the major questions are: one, front court depth; two, their rebounding; three, the fit between all these talented scorers. Throwing guys like Mustafa Heron and Dixon and Figueroa into an already existing situation with Pons and Justin Simon and Marvin Clark. And then how will this or will this talent finally translate? Can they jump 6 or 7 teams in the Big East standings and kind of make that push to the second or third spot that their talent indicates that they can? And if and when they go small, how effective will that be? We literally just talked about that in terms of the defensive limitations or ramifications there.
Yeah, it should be pretty interesting. Gut feel here. Is Chris Mullin done if they don't make the NCAA tournament?
I would normally say yes, but I did see that they got 2 crystal ball picks on the 24/7 recruiting website recently. One for Aiden Igihan, the 5-star center, and one for Scotty Lewis, who's a top 10 recruit on the wing. So if they can land both those guys before the season starts, it would be hard to fire Mullin with all this talent and then those 2 guys coming in.
Yeah, I do think the elephant in the room is the fact that he's a legend at St. John's. You can't fire him early. You have to give him the chance. I mean, I'm generally a guy who says never keep a coach due to the recruits. Now, obviously, Jimmy's and Joe's over X's and O's, but we saw with a guy like Lorenzo Romar, if it just wasn't going to happen, it wasn't going to happen. I think if he can't win with this team, it's not going to happen. Even with a guy like a Gihan, with a guy like Scotty Lewis, maybe they'd make the NCAA tournament, but they definitely would. I don't think they'd live up to the hype. So for me, it's just it's difficult for me to back a coach who is consistently who's kind of consistently struggled throughout his coaching career. Obviously, it's early, he's still learning, but this is definitely a close to a make or break year for the St. John's program. I think they make the NCAA tournament. That's kind of where I am at this point. I don't know where you stand, Brad. I don't think we're going to get to that, but if he doesn't, it's going to be really interesting to watch what happens, especially with a new athletic director coming to town.
Yeah, I think with Heron, they're absolutely in an NCAA tournament, or else this season was a complete disaster. I have them just outside the top 25 now, but I think that they may get moved into my top 25 as the season gets closer. And then I have them third in the Big East behind Villanova and Marquette, but I may swap Marquette in St. John's, because just the more I look at the St. John's team, the more I'm intrigued with their potential upside, even though doing this deep dive kind of revealed a lot more question marks than I had realized.
They're really talented. They're really flawed. The rest of the Big East is, I wouldn't say down, but there's not a clear team, especially beyond Villanova, that I'm in love with. I know you're a big Marquette guy. I'm not necessarily there yet. And this league, I mean, St. John should be in the top 4 in this league if they have Mustafa Heron. No excuses. I think that just has to be where they are if they have Heron. If not, I think maybe 5th or 6th is acceptable. But at this point, I still think the talent is there to be a top 5 team in the Big East, and Chris Mullin just has to get it done.
Yeah, I would say 2nd or 3rd, leaning 2nd with Heron, 5th without Heron.
Yeah, I think I'll go 3rd or 6th without Heron. 3rd with, 6th without. So that'll be my prediction. NCAA tournament with Heron, very much a bubble without, but I think they'd get in.
Agree. So that'll do it for today, I think. Any other remarks about Oregon or St. John's?
I don't think so. I really enjoyed this, man. I feel like I learned a lot about these teams, and I think that'll be one of the better things about doing this. Is I think our coverage just overall will improve. I hope you guys can if you're just neutral listeners, learn about these teams. If you're fans of these teams, definitely chime in on Twitter with us and give us your thoughts on what we have to say, because I've always thought that fans know their team better than anyone else. Now, obviously, they may have a biased view of it, and you have to understand that when you're reading what they have to say, or on Twitter, or what may have you. But I definitely think I learned from fans, especially some of the better ones out there. So definitely chime in if you guys have thoughts on this team, on either of these teams. But definitely enjoyed this one. Hope to do it again soon.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good one.